I found the handwritten diary tucked behind dusty Christmas decorations in my attic, pages yellowed with age and secrets I thought I'd buried forever. My son Marcus had been helping me pack for the move to my new apartment when he pulled it from behind a box of ornaments, holding it like he'd discovered treasure. The leather cover was cracked, the brass clasp tarnished, and written in faded gold letters across the front was 1987, Elena's private thoughts. I watched his face change as he read the first entry about his father, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched him sink to his knees on the dusty attic floor as 37 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled around us both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for the past 2 years, I had become a ghost in my own family's story. It started slowly, the way most erasures do, with small comments and subtle exclusions that accumulated like dust in corners you stop noticing. My daughter-in-law, Brittany, had perfected the art of making someone disappear without ever raising her voice or throwing a tantrum. She wielded politeness like a scalpel, cutting away pieces of my presence with surgical precision. I used to be someone who mattered. From 1985 to 2010, I ran Esperanza Community Center in East Los Angeles, a place where immigrant families found their footing in America. I taught English classes to mothers who cleaned office buildings at night and dreamed in Spanish but worked in English. I helped fathers navigate school systems for their children, translated medical documents, and wrote recommendation letters for kids applying to colleges their parents had never imagined they could attend. The walls of my office were covered with graduation photos, wedding invitations, and thank you cards written in broken English that meant more to me than any professional award ever could. Marcus used to bring his friends by the center after school. He'd sit in the corner doing homework while I led citizenship classes, and sometimes he'd help translate when the adults struggled with particularly difficult concepts. He was proud of me then, proud of the work I did, proud of the way people in our neighborhood looked at me with respect and gratitude. When he graduated high school as valedictorian, his speech mentioned how watching me serve our community had taught him the meaning of purpose. I saved that speech, typed it up, and kept it in my desk drawer for 20 years. After my husband Roberto died suddenly of a heart attack when Marcus was 15, the center became our lifeline. Not just financially, though the steady income helped us survive, but emotionally. The families I served became our extended relatives, celebrating Marcus's achievements and supporting us through our darkest moments. Mrs. Chen brought homemade soup when I caught pneumonia. The Morales family helped Marcus practice for his SATs in their kitchen while their own children did homework at the same table. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving in a community that understood the value of lifting each other up. Marcus excelled in everything he touched. He earned a full scholarship to UCLA, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration, and landed a coveted position at a consulting firm in Manhattan. I was so proud I could barely contain myself. Here was my son, the child of a community center director and a factory worker who died too young, making 6 figures before his 25th birthday, and living in a sleek apartment overlooking Central Park. When he met Brittany at a networking event 3 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. She was beautiful, educated, and ambitious, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an MBA from Columbia. She worked in marketing for a luxury skincare brand and had an Instagram account with 40,000 followers who hung on her every post about clean living and aspirational lifestyle choices. During their early dating phase, Marcus would FaceTime me from expensive restaurants and charity galas, grinning as he introduced me to his glamorous girlfriend. But something shifted after they got engaged 18 months ago. The FaceTime calls became shorter and less frequent. When I visited them in New York, I felt like an intruder in their carefully curated world of minimalist furniture and artisanal everything. Brittany would smile and make polite conversation, but her eyes would dart to my discount store clothes and sensible shoes with barely concealed disapproval. She never said anything directly critical, but her compliments had a way of landing, like insults wrapped in silk. "Elena, your energy is so authentic," she'd say with that practiced influencer smile. "It's refreshing to meet someone who doesn't care about appearances." Or when I brought homemade tamales to their housewarming party, she accepted them graciously while explaining to guests that she was trying to eat more mindfully these days, effectively ensuring no one touched the food I'd spent hours preparing. Marcus seemed different around her, more polished but somehow smaller. The man who used to call me every Sunday to check in and share stories about his week now sent brief text messages and seemed perpetually distracted during our conversations. When I suggested he visit Los Angeles for the community center's annual fundraising gala, an event I'd been organizing for 15 years, he hesitated before explaining that Brittany had already committed them to a wine tasting weekend in the Hamptons that same date. The wedding planning process revealed just how thoroughly I'd been relegated to the margins of my son's life. Every decision was filtered through Brittany's vision of elegance and sophistication. The venue had to be Instagram-worthy. The guest list needed to be curated for the right energy. When I offered to contribute financially, suggesting we use some of my retirement savings to help pay for the flowers or music, Brittany thanked me sweetly, but explained that they wanted to keep things cohesive and had already hired professionals who understood their aesthetic. I felt like a visitor at my own son's wedding, dressed in a navy blue dress that Brittany had helped me select, because my original choice was a little too vibrant for the color palette. During the reception, I sat at a table with Marcus's college friends' parents, making polite conversation while watching my son and his new wife glide through the evening like magazine models. When it came time for speeches, Marcus thanked everyone who had supported them, mentioned Brittany's parents, specifically for their generosity and guidance, and gave me a generic acknowledgement as the woman who raised me to be the man I am today. It was technically correct, but felt hollow, like he was checking a box rather than speaking from his heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After they returned from their honeymoon in Italy, the distance became even more pronounced. They moved into a larger apartment in Tribeca, and when I visited, I noticed there were no photos of me or Roberto visible anywhere. The walls were decorated with abstract art and professional photographs of Marcus and Brittany looking like they belonged in a catalog. When I asked about it, Brittany explained that they were going for a clean, modern look and had put family photos in the bedroom where they were more intimate and personal. The final straw came during Thanksgiving last year. For 22 years, I had hosted the holiday at my small house in Eagle Rock, cooking traditional Mexican dishes alongside turkey and stuffing, creating a fusion feast that reflected our family's journey. Marcus had always looked forward to it, bringing friends who couldn't make it home and helping me set up folding tables in the living room to accommodate everyone. But when I called to confirm the menu and ask if they wanted to invite any of their New York friends, Marcus hesitated before explaining that Brittany's family had invited them to spend the holiday at their house in Connecticut. "It's just easier this way, Mom," he said, his voice strained with guilt. "Brittany's parents are getting older, and they really want us there. You understand, right?" I understood more than he realized. I understood that I was being carefully, systematically erased from the narrative of his life. I understood that the woman he'd married saw me as an obstacle to the sophisticated image she was crafting for their relationship. I understood that my son, the boy who once defended me fiercely when a teacher made assumptions about his academic potential based on our last name, was now choosing silence over standing up for the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. I spent Thanksgiving alone that year, heating up a Stouffer's turkey dinner and watching old home videos of Marcus as a child, running around the community center and proudly showing off his latest school project to anyone who would listen. The contrast between that confident, loving boy and the distant man who now answered my calls with distracted politeness was almost too painful to bear. As winter settled over Los Angeles, I found myself questioning everything. Had I been too involved in his life? Was I embarrassing him somehow? Did my modest lifestyle and working-class background really not fit with the world he was trying to build? I started second-guessing every conversation, analyzing every text message for signs that I was becoming a burden rather than a blessing in his life. The community center, which had always been my source of strength and purpose, began to feel like a reminder of how irrelevant I'd become. The families I served still appreciated my work, still trusted me with their most important documents and decisions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if my own son didn't value what I'd built, maybe it truly wasn't worth much after all. When Marcus called in February to tell me they were expecting their first child, I should have been overjoyed. Instead, I felt a complicated mixture of happiness and dread. I was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a grandmother, but I couldn't help wondering what role I'd be allowed to play in my grandchild's life. Would I be the abuela who baked cookies and told stories about the old days? Or would I be another element that didn't quite fit Brittany's vision of their perfect family? The pregnancy announcement came with an immediate caveat. Brittany had already researched the best pediatricians, enrolled in exclusive prenatal classes, and created a registry filled with organic, non-toxic, expertly recommended baby gear. When I offered to throw a baby shower or help prepare the nursery, I was politely but firmly redirected toward supporting them in ways that felt right for their journey. Translation: stay in your lane and let us define what that lane looks like. By the time spring arrived, I had effectively become a monthly check-in call and a carefully worded text message relationship with my only child. I'd gone from being the most important woman in Marcus's life to being a pleasant but irrelevant figure from his past. Someone to be managed rather than celebrated, tolerated rather than treasured. I began to withdraw, not out of anger but out of exhaustion. Fighting for relevance in someone else's life is soul-crushing work, especially when that someone used to be the center of your universe. I stopped calling as frequently, stopped offering to visit, stopped suggesting family traditions that would probably be politely declined anyway. I focused on my work at the community center, threw myself into helping other people's families navigate their challenges, and tried to convince myself that being needed professionally was enough to sustain me emotionally. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of loneliness pressed down like a heavy blanket, I would lie awake wondering how I had become so disposable to the person I loved most in the world. I had spent 38 years building a life around being Marcus's mother, and now that identity was being slowly, systematically stripped away, leaving me unsure of who I was supposed to be in this new reality where my love was unwanted and my presence was inconvenient. The move to a smaller apartment had been my decision, a practical choice driven by finances, and the growing realization that I didn't need a 3-bedroom house for one person who rarely received visitors. But as I packed up decades of memories, each box felt like another step away from the life I'd known, another acknowledgement that the future I'd imagined for my family was never going to materialize. That's when Marcus found the diary, on a humid Saturday morning in July when the Los Angeles heat made the attic feel like an oven. I had been dreading this packing session for weeks, knowing that every box we opened would contain another piece of my past that no longer seemed to have a place in my present. Marcus had flown in from New York to help me sort through everything before the movers came, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times as we worked side by side, sharing memories triggered by forgotten photographs and saved school projects. He had changed since becoming a father 6 months ago. Little Isabella had softened something in him, brought back glimpses of the thoughtful, family-oriented man I remembered raising. During his visit, he'd shown me dozens of photos on his phone, his face lighting up as he described her first smile, her sleeping patterns, the way she gripped his finger with surprising strength. But even those tender moments were filtered through Brittany's perspective, Stories about how she'd researched the perfect sleep schedule or chosen the ideal developmental toys based on expert recommendations. When Marcus pulled the diary from behind the Christmas decorations, I felt my blood freeze. I had hidden it there deliberately 37 years ago, in a moment of panic and shame that I thought I'd successfully buried. The leather binding was more weathered than I remembered, the pages brittle with age, but my handwriting was still clearly visible through the yellowed paper. Before I could stop him, he had opened to a random page and begun reading aloud, probably expecting to find amusing anecdotes about his childhood or sweet memories of his father. Instead, he found the truth about Roberto that I had never intended for anyone to discover. His voice faltered as he read the first entry from March 15th, 1987. Roberto came home drunk again tonight. The bruises on my ribs are getting harder to hide, but I can't let anyone at the center see them. If they knew what really happens behind our closed doors, I'd lose all credibility with the families I'm trying to help. How can I counsel women about leaving abusive relationships when I can't even leave my own? The diary slipped from his hands and hit the attic floor with a soft thud. Marcus stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror, confusion, and betrayal that cut through me like a blade. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of a revelation that changed everything he thought he knew about his childhood, his father and the woman who had raised him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking like it had when he was 12 and trying not to cry. "What is this? What does this mean?" I wanted to lie, to tell him it was fiction, a creative writing exercise from my community college English class. But as I looked at his face, pale and stricken in the dim attic light, I realized that 37 years of carefully constructed protection was crumbling around us. The truth I had worked so hard to bury was surfacing anyway, and no amount of deflection could put it back underground. "Sit down, mijo," I said softly, gesturing to an old trunk near the window. "There are things about your father that I never wanted you to know." What followed was the most difficult conversation of my life. I told him about the Roberto he had never seen, the man who appeared only after several drinks and disappeared again by morning, leaving behind bruises, broken dishes, and a wife who became expert at applying concealer and creating explanations for injuries that couldn't be hidden. I explained how his father's violence was never directed at him, how Roberto seemed to understand that hurting Marcus would cross a line that even his worst impulses wouldn't breach, but how that protection had come at the cost of my own safety. Marcus listened with growing anguish as I described the cycle that had defined the first 8 years of his life. Roberto would have a bad day at the factory, stop at the bar on his way home, and return to our house carrying the weight of frustrations. He couldn't articulate an anger he could only express through his fists. The next morning, he would be remorseful, gentle, the loving husband and father that Marcus remembered, bringing me flowers from the grocery store and taking us out for breakfast as if nothing had happened. "But he loved you," Marcus said desperately, clinging to the narrative he'd constructed about his parents' relationship. "I remember him being so affectionate with you, so proud of your work at the center. He used to brag about you to his friends." "He did love me," I agreed. And that was perhaps the most complicated truth of all. Your father wasn't a monster, Marcus. He was a broken man who never learned how to handle his emotions without violence. The Roberto you remember was real, but so was the Roberto who hurt me. People can be both things at the same time, and that's what made it so hard to leave. I pulled out more entries from the diary, pages I hadn't looked at in decades but whose words were burned into my memory. I read him the entry from June 3rd, 1987. Marcus asked me today why I always wear long sleeves, even when it's hot. I told him I get cold easily, and he brought me his little sweater to wear. How do I explain to a 7-year-old that his mother is covered in fingerprint bruises from his father's hands? How do I tell him that the man who reads him bedtime stories and helps him build Lego castles also throws dishes at the wall when he's angry? With each entry, I watched Marcus's face change. The idealized image of his father, carefully preserved and polished over 3 decades, was cracking apart. But more than that, he was beginning to understand the woman I had been during those years. The Elena who had somehow managed to run a community center during the day while hiding domestic violence at night, who had counseled other women to leave, their abusers while staying trapped in her own cycle of fear and shame. "Why didn't you leave him?" Marcus asked, and I could hear the pain in his voice, the struggle to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew about his family. "Because I was 24 years old with no family in this country, no college degree, and a job that barely paid enough to cover rent," I said simply. "Because Roberto convinced me that no one else would ever love me, that I was lucky he put up with my ambitions and my work. Because leaving meant admitting that the strong woman everyone at the community center looked up to was actually weak and helpless in her own home." I told him about the support group I had secretly attended, meeting in the basement of a church 20 miles away where no one would recognize me. I described the escape plan I had developed over months, slowly saving money and gathering important documents. I explained how Roberto's death, as sudden and tragic as it was, had felt like both devastating loss and unexpected liberation. "The night he died," I said, pulling out the final entry from the diary, dated December 10th, 1987, "I wrote something I've never been able to forget." I read the words aloud, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "Roberto had a heart attack at work today." As I sat in the hospital waiting room, holding Marcus while he cried for his daddy, I felt the most terrible combination of grief and relief. I loved my husband, but I was also afraid of him. Now I'll never have to choose between protecting my son and protecting myself, because that choice has been made for me. Marcus was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the sea, deepest parts of his soul. "I don't understand," he kept saying. "I don't understand how I never knew. I don't understand how you survived it. I don't understand how you kept being so strong for everyone else." That's when I realized that this conversation wasn't just about revealing the truth about his father. It was about helping Marcus understand the woman I had always been, the survivor who had learned to compartmentalize trauma so effectively that even her own son hadn't seen the scars. For 37 years, I had protected him from this knowledge, but in doing so, I had also hidden from him the full extent of my strength, my resilience, my capacity to transform pain into purpose. "After your father died," I continued, "I made a promise to myself and to you. I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small or powerless. I would use everything I had learned about surviving abuse to help other women find their way to safety. And I would raise you to understand that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." I told him about the domestic violence support programs I had quietly developed at the community center, how I had trained myself to recognize the signs of abuse in the women who came to my English classes, how I had created safe spaces and resources for families escaping dangerous situations. The work had been my way of transforming my own trauma into something meaningful, of ensuring that my suffering had served a purpose beyond just surviving. "Everything I did after your father died was aimed at making sure you grew up to be a different kind of man," I said. "I wanted you to see women as equals, to understand that love should never involve fear or control. I thought I had succeeded in that, Marcus. I thought I had raised you to value strength and dignity in the people you love." The words hung between us, and I could see him processing not just the revelation about his father, but the implications for his own life, his own marriage, his own treatment of the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a better future. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Just as Roberto had made me feel small and unworthy, Marcus had allowed Brittany to gradually erase my presence from their lives, to make me feel like an embarrassment rather than an asset. "Oh God," he whispered, finally understanding the connection. "What have I done? What have I allowed to happen?" The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur of difficult conversations and painful revelations. Marcus asked question after question about our life with Roberto, trying to reconcile his memories with this new reality. I showed him other documents I had kept hidden, including letters from the women's shelter where I had volunteered. Thank you. Notes from families I had helped escape dangerous situations, and newspaper clippings about the domestic violence prevention programs I had pioneered at the community center. As the sun began to set through the attic window, casting long shadows, across the boxes of our family history, Marcus looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, "about how I've been treating you lately, about the choices I've been making." What followed was his own confession, an acknowledgement of how he had allowed Brittany to gradually push me to the margins of their lives. He talked about the small compromises that had accumulated over time, the way he had rationalized each exclusion and dismissal as keeping peace in his marriage, rather than recognizing them as betrayals of the woman who had given him everything. He admitted that he had been ashamed of our modest background, embarrassed by the gap between my working-class lifestyle and the sophisticated image Brittany wanted to project. "I became just like him," Marcus said, his voice hollow with the weight of this realization. "Not physically, but emotionally. I let someone convince me that you weren't good enough, that you didn't fit, that you were something to be managed rather than celebrated. I abandoned you just like he did, just in a different way." The parallel was devastating, but necessary. For the first time in 2 years, my son was seeing me clearly, understanding not just what I had endured, but what I had overcome, not just who I had been as his mother, but who I was as a woman who had transformed trauma into triumph, who had built something meaningful from the ashes of her broken marriage. As we sat in that sweltering attic, surrounded by the remnants of our shared history, I felt something shift between us. The distance that had grown over the past 2 years began to close, replaced by a deeper understanding of who we both were and what we meant to each other. Marcus was seeing me not as the embarrassing relic of his past that Brittany had painted me to be, but as the survivor and advocate I had always been, the woman who had shaped him into the man he was capable of becoming. "I want to make this right," he said finally. "I want to honor everything you've done, everything you've survived, everything you've built. I want Isabella to know who her abuela really is, not the watered-down version I've been presenting. I want to be the man you raised me to be." The conversation continued well into the evening, moving from the attic to the kitchen where we shared a simple dinner and talked about the future we could build together. For the first time in years, I felt seen and valued by my son, not despite my history, but because of it. Not in spite of my strength, but in celebration of it. The truth about Roberto had been painful to reveal, but it had also revealed the truth about me, about the depths of my resilience and the power of my love. As Marcus prepared to return to New York the next morning, he made a promise that would change everything. "I'm going to have a conversation with Brittany," he said. "A real conversation about respect and family and the kind of people we want to be. And if she can't accept and celebrate the incredible woman who raised me, then she's going to have to make some choices about what matters more to her." For the first time in 2 years, I felt hope blooming in my chest, not just for my relationship with Marcus, but for the example we could set for Isabella, showing her that families should lift each other up rather than tear each other down, that love should expand our world rather than shrink it, that the women who came before us deserve honor rather than erasure. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began with a phone call 3 days after Marcus returned to New York. I was sitting in my nearly empty living room, surrounded by packed boxes and feeling the weight of decades of memories, when my phone rang at 7 p.m. Pacific time. It was Marcus, and his voice carried a determination I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I need to tell you about the conversation I had with Brittany," he said without preamble. "And I need to tell you about some decisions we've made as a family." What followed was a 20-minute account of the most difficult discussion of his marriage. Marcus had sat Brittany down the evening after he returned from Los Angeles and told her everything about the diary, about Roberto, about the woman I truly was beneath the surface she had chosen to see. He described how he had laid out the parallel between his father's emotional abuse and the way I had been systematically excluded from their lives. How he had made it clear that this pattern was ending immediately. Brittany's initial reaction had been defensive, then dismissive. She argued that she had never meant to hurt anyone, that she was simply trying to build a life that reflected their values and aspirations. She couldn't understand why Marcus was suddenly making such a big deal about his mother's feelings, especially when I had seemed fine with the way things were. But Marcus had persisted, armed with a new understanding of what strength looked like and what family meant. I told her that if she couldn't respect and celebrate you, then she was choosing to disrespect the most important relationship in my life, Marcus said. I told her that Isabella is going to know her abuela as the incredible woman you are, not as some embarrassing secret we keep hidden in California. And I told her that if she couldn't get on board with that, then we had bigger problems than wedding planning and Instagram aesthetics. The ultimatum had worked, partly because Brittany genuinely loved Marcus, and partly because she was smart enough to recognize that she was outnumbered. Marcus had also shown her some of the newspaper clippings about my work at the community center, articles that highlighted my role in developing innovative support programs for immigrant families and domestic violence survivors. Seeing my accomplishments in print, documented by legitimate media outlets, had shifted something in her perspective. She wants to apologize to you personally, Marcus continued, and she wants to start over. She's also agreed to bring Isabella to Los Angeles next month so you can have real time with your granddaughter, not just the brief supervised visits we've been limiting you to. I felt tears streaming down my face, but they were different tears than I had cried in the attic. These were tears of relief, of vindication, of a door opening that I had thought was permanently sealed. But more than that, they were tears of pride in the man my son had chosen to become in the face of difficult truths. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow miracle. Brittany did call to apologize, and while the conversation was initially awkward and clearly rehearsed, there was genuine remorse in her voice. She admitted that she had made assumptions about me based on superficial observations, that she had confused sophistication with character and style with substance. She asked questions about my work at the community center, about the programs I had developed, about the families I had helped over the years. What surprised me most was her admission that she had been intimidated by me from the beginning, threatened by the obvious closeness between Marcus and me, worried that she would never measure up to the woman who had raised such an exceptional man. Her attempts to minimize my presence hadn't been motivated by malice but by insecurity, a fear that there wasn't room for both of us in Marcus's life. I realize now that I was trying to compete with you instead of learning from you, she said during our second conversation. Marcus told me about everything you survived and everything you built, and I feel like such a fool for not seeing it before. I want to do better, Elena. I want Isabella to know the real you. The visit in August exceeded every expectation I had dared to hold. Marcus, Brittany, and 6-month-old Isabella spent a full week in Los Angeles, staying in a hotel, but spending their days at my house and at the community center. I watched Brittany's eyes widen as she toured the facility, seeing the English classroom where I had taught thousands of immigrants to navigate American systems, the resource center where families found help with everything from housing to healthcare, the childcare room where children played while their parents attended citizenship classes. "You built all of this?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine awe as we stood in the main hall decorated with flags from dozens of countries and photos of families who had found their footing in America through our programs. "Not by myself," I replied, gesturing to the wall of volunteer appreciation plaques and staff photos spanning 3 decades. But I helped guide it, shaped it, nurtured it into what it became. She spent 20 minutes reading the thank you. Letters displayed in frames throughout the facility. Notes written in multiple languages expressing gratitude for services that had changed lives. One letter, from a woman named Maria Gonzalez, particularly caught her attention. It described how I had helped her escape an abusive marriage, connected her with legal aid, and supported her through the process of gaining custody of her children. The letter was dated 1995, 8 years after Roberto's death, and it demonstrated the direct line between my personal trauma and my professional mission. "You turned your own pain into a way to help other people," Brittany said quietly. "That's not just impressive, Elena. That's heroic." The week continued with a series of revelations and reconnections. I took them to the local college where I had finally earned my bachelor's degree at age 42, attending night classes while working full-time and raising Marcus. We visited the community garden I had helped establish, where immigrant families grew vegetables from their home countries and shared recipes that kept their cultural traditions alive. We stopped by the legal aid clinic where I had volunteered for 15 years, helping families navigate immigration paperwork and family court procedures. At each location, people recognized me and approached with warm embraces and updates about their lives. Former students introduced their American-born children to Mrs. Elena, the woman who had helped their parents learn English and find their first jobs. Colleagues shared stories about programs I had initiated, problems I had solved, families I had kept together during their darkest moments. Marcus watched these interactions with growing amazement, seeing me through fresh eyes as the respected community leader I had always been. Brittany documented everything on her phone, not for social media, but for her own understanding, creating a record of the legacy I had built while she had been dismissing me as irrelevant. The turning point came on Thursday evening when we attended a celebration dinner for the community center's 35th anniversary. The event was held in the high school gymnasium, decorated with papel picado and filled with 300 people whose lives had been touched by our programs over the decades. I had helped plan the event, but hadn't expected to be honored in any special way, thinking of myself as just another long-time volunteer. Instead, I found myself being called to the stage for a surprise tribute. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, the center's current director and my former colleague, spoke about my contributions to the organization and the community. She described how I had written the original grant proposals that secured federal funding for our domestic violence programs, how I had trained hundreds of volunteers, how I had personally mentored dozens of young social workers who had gone on to leadership positions in nonprofit organizations across California. Elena Vasquez didn't just work at Esperanza Community Center, Dr. Rodriguez said to the packed auditorium. She helped build it into the institution it is today. Her vision of comprehensive family services, her understanding of the connections between education, safety, and opportunity, her belief that everyone deserves dignity and support regardless of their immigration status or their past mistakes. These principles became the foundation of everything we do. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. As I looked out at the crowd, I saw faces from every era of my career. Families I had helped decades ago now standing beside families I was currently serving. I saw young adults who had attended our after-school programs as children, now bringing their own children to the same classrooms where they had first learned to navigate American culture while maintaining their heritage. Marcus and Brittany were in the front row, both crying openly. Brittany was recording the speech on her phone, but she kept lowering the device to simply watch and listen. Later, she would tell me that sitting in that auditorium, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives I had touched, she finally understood not just what I had accomplished, but who I was at my core. The tribute continued with a video presentation featuring testimonials from people I had helped over the years. Maria Gonzalez, now a successful business owner, spoke about how I had given her the courage to leave her abusive husband and the resources to build a new life. Carlos Mendoza, a college professor, credited me with helping his family navigate the education system that allowed him to become the first person in his family to earn a doctorate. Dr. Sarah Kim, now Director of Immigrant Services for Los Angeles County, described how I had mentored her as a young social worker and taught her that effective advocacy required both professional expertise and personal compassion. As the video ended, Dr. Rodriguez announced that the center's board of directors had voted to name the Domestic Violence Support Program in my honor. The Elena Vasquez Family Safety Initiative will ensure that the work she pioneered continues to serve families for generations to come, she said, as they unveiled a plaque that would be permanently installed in the center's main lobby. The evening concluded with a reception where I was surrounded by well-wishers, former colleagues, and families whose stories intertwined with mine across decades of shared work. Marcus and Brittany stayed close to my side, listening to story after story about my impact on the community. I watched Brittany's expression change throughout the evening, saw her beginning to understand that the woman she had dismissed as out of touch was actually deeply connected to something much larger and more meaningful than social media followers or designer handbags. On the drive home that night, Marcus was quiet in the passenger seat while Brittany held Isabella in the back. Finally, he spoke up from the darkness of the car. "I had no idea," he said simply. "I knew you worked hard. I knew people respected you, but I had no idea of the scope of what you've built, no idea how many lives you've changed." "I never wanted to brag about it," I replied. The work was its own reward. Seeing families succeed, watching children grow up to become leaders in their communities, knowing that I played some small part in helping people build better lives, that was always enough for me. "It shouldn't have been enough," Brittany said from the back seat, her voice thick with emotion. "You should have been celebrated for this work. You should have been honored and recognized and included in everything, not pushed aside because someone like me was too shallow to see what was right in front of her." The rest of their visit was filled with meaningful conversations and genuine connections. Brittany asked thoughtful questions about my work, my experiences as a single mother, my journey from domestic violence survivor to advocate for other women in similar situations. She seemed genuinely interested in learning from me rather than simply tolerating my presence. We spent hours talking about Isabella's future, about the values we wanted to instill in her, about the importance of understanding family history and honoring the sacrifices previous generations had made. Brittany even asked if I would be willing to teach Isabella Spanish as she grew up, recognizing that bilingualism was an asset rather than something to be ashamed of. On their last day in Los Angeles, we visited Roberto's grave together. I hadn't been there in years, but I felt ready to face that part of my history with Marcus beside me. As we stood at the headstone, I told Isabella about her grandfather, sharing the good memories while acknowledging the complicated truth of who he had been. "Your abuelo loved you, mija," I whispered to the baby in my arms, "but he was a troubled man who never learned how to be peaceful. Your daddy learned different lessons, and he's going to teach you that love should feel safe and warm, never scary or painful." As we prepared for them to return to New York, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that everything is going to be different now," he said. "Not just between us, but in how we live our lives. Brittany and I have been talking about what kind of parents we want to be, what kind of marriage we want to have, what kind of family we want to build, and all of those conversations start with honoring you and everything you've taught me." He paused, struggling with emotion before continuing. "I also want you to know that I'm proud to be your son. Not despite where we come from, but because of it. I'm proud of this community, proud of your work, proud of the strength you've shown. And I want Isabella to grow up proud of it too." The week had transformed all of us, but perhaps most of all, it had transformed how I saw myself. For 2 years, I had allowed other people's judgment to convince me that I was becoming irrelevant, that my work and my values were outdated, that I needed to shrink myself to fit into their vision of respectability. But standing in that gymnasium, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives I had touched, I remembered who I had always been. Not just a survivor, but a leader. Not just a mother, but a community builder. Not just someone who had overcome trauma, but someone who had transformed that trauma into a source of strength for others. The months following their visit brought changes I hadn't dared to imagine. Marcus called every Sunday morning without fail, not with the distracted, obligatory check-ins of the past 2 years, but with genuine enthusiasm to share his week and hear about mine. Brittany would often join these calls, asking thoughtful questions about my current projects at the community center and sharing updates about Isabella's development with the kind of detail that made me feel like a true grandmother rather than a distant relative. But the most significant transformation came in October when Marcus called with an unexpected proposal. "Mom, Brittany and I have been talking, and we want to ask you something important," he began, his voice carrying the same nervous excitement I remembered from his childhood when he was planning a surprise. "We're thinking about moving back to California." The words hit me like a gentle earthquake, rearranging everything I thought I knew about my future. Marcus explained that the revelation about Roberto and my work in the community had sparked long conversations between him and Brittany about the kind of life they wanted to build for Isabella. They had begun to question whether the fast-paced, image-focused lifestyle of New York was really where they wanted to raise their daughter, whether the values being modeled in their social circle aligned with the principles they actually wanted to instill in their child. "We want Isabella to grow up knowing her abuela, really knowing you," Brittany added when she joined the call. "Not just seeing you twice a year for carefully managed visits, but having you be part of her daily life. We want her to learn Spanish from you, to understand where her family comes from, to see what real community service looks like by watching you work." Marcus had been offered a position with a consulting firm in Los Angeles, a role that would allow him to work with nonprofit organizations and social enterprises rather than the purely profit-driven corporations he had been serving in New York. The salary was lower than what he was making on the East Coast, but the work aligned more closely with the values I had tried to instill in him throughout his childhood. I realized that somewhere along the way I lost sight of why I went into business in the first place, he admitted. I wanted to use my skills to help organizations make a positive impact, to be part of solutions rather than just generating wealth for people who already had plenty. Watching you at that anniversary dinner reminded me that success isn't measured by salary or social status, but by the lives you touch and the difference you make. The move took place over the holidays, a chaotic but joyful process that felt like watching my family rebuild itself from the ground up. Marcus and Brittany found a house in Pasadena, close enough to the community center that I could see Isabella regularly, but far enough away that we all maintained our independence. Brittany threw herself into the relocation with the same intense focus she had once applied to curating their New York lifestyle. But now that energy was directed toward understanding and embracing our family's Los Angeles roots. She spent hours researching the history of the neighborhoods where I had worked, learning about the waves of immigration that had shaped the city's character, understanding the policy challenges that affected the families I served. She visited the community center multiple times, not as a reluctant observer, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding the work we did and how she might contribute to it. "I want to help," she announced during one of these visits, standing in the middle of our computer literacy classroom where elderly immigrants were learning to video chat with relatives in their home countries. "I have marketing and social media skills that could be useful here. I could help you reach more people, document the success stories, maybe even help with grant applications." The offer was sincere and practical. Brittany's professional expertise in digital marketing was exactly what the community center needed to expand its reach and improve its fundraising capabilities. But more than that, Her desire to contribute represented a fundamental shift in how she saw herself in relation to our family and our community. Instead of trying to distance herself from my work, she wanted to amplify it. Over the following months, Brittany became an invaluable volunteer, creating social media campaigns that showcased our programs and brought in new donors, developing professional quality materials that helped us secure larger grants, and using her network of contacts to connect the center with resources we had never been able to access before. Her Instagram account, once filled exclusively with lifestyle content and brand partnerships, began featuring stories about immigrant families, domestic violence survivors, and community resilience. The transformation in her online presence was remarkable. Instead of generic motivational quotes and product placements, she shared real stories from the families we served, always with their permission, and always with deep respect for their privacy and dignity. Her followers, initially confused by the shift in content, gradually became engaged supporters of the center's work. Several of her influencer friends began making donations and sharing our content with their own audiences. I never realized how empty my online presence was before, she confided to me one afternoon as we prepared materials for a citizenship class. All those posts about perfect moments and perfect products, none of it meant anything. But this work, sharing these stories, connecting people to causes that matter, this feels like the first time my platform has actually served a purpose. Marcus, meanwhile, was thriving in his new role. The consulting firm specialized in helping nonprofit organizations improve their operational efficiency and expand their impact, work that utilized his business skills while serving a mission he could believe in. His first major project involved developing a comprehensive evaluation system for youth development programs across Los Angeles County, research that would help organizations like ours demonstrate their effectiveness to funders and policymakers. I wake up excited about work now, he told me during one of our Sunday dinners, a tradition we had reestablished once they moved back to California. Instead of helping rich companies get richer, I'm helping organizations that are actually making a difference become more effective at changing lives. It feels like the career I was always meant to have. But the most profound changes were happening in Isabella. At 18 months old, she was beginning to talk, and her vocabulary included both English and Spanish words learned during her frequent visits to my house. She would clap her hands when she heard mariachi music, reach for the photographs of Roberto that I had finally felt ready to display again, and fall asleep to the lullabies I sang in Spanish, the same songs I had sung to Marcus decades earlier. Watching Isabella explore my house with fearless curiosity, pulling books off shelves and examining the artifacts of my life and career, I felt a deep sense of continuity that had been missing for years. She was growing up surrounded by the evidence of her family's history, learning that her abuela was not just someone who babysat occasionally, but someone who had built something meaningful in the world. One evening in March, almost a year after Marcus had found the diary, we were all gathered in my living room for Isabella's first birthday celebration. As I watched my granddaughter take her tentative first steps between her parents, surrounded by friends from the community center and colleagues from Marcus's new job, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The room was filled with the sounds of multiple languages and generations, children playing while adults shared stories and laughter. Dr. Rodriguez was there with her family, along with several of the women I had helped over the years, who had become close friends. Marcus's new colleagues mingled easily with my old ones, united by their shared commitment to social justice and community building. Brittany was documenting the party not for social media, but for Isabella's baby book, creating a record of her daughter's first birthday that captured the richness and diversity of the community she was growing up in. At one point, I saw her interviewing Maria Gonzalez, the woman whose thank you letter had moved her so deeply during their first visit to the center, asking about her experiences as an immigrant mother and how she had built a successful business after escaping domestic violence. I want Isabella to understand that she comes from a long line of strong women, Brittany explained when I asked about the interviews. Not just you and me, but all the women whose lives intersected with yours, who found strength through the programs you built, who went on to create better lives for their own children. These stories are part of her heritage, too. As the evening wound down and Isabella finally fell asleep in my arms, Marcus pulled out a wrapped gift he had been saving for the end of the celebration. "This is for you, Mom," he said, his voice emotional. "It's something Brittany and I worked on together." Inside the box was a professionally bound book titled The Elena Vasquez Legacy, 35 Years of Community Building. The cover featured a photograph from the anniversary dinner, showing me on stage accepting the tribute, surrounded by the flags and faces of the community I had served. Inside were interviews with dozens of people whose lives I had touched, photographs from throughout my career, copies of newspaper articles about programs I had developed, and testimonials from colleagues who described my impact on the field of social work. But the most moving section was the final chapter, written by Marcus and Brittany together, titled Learning to See, A Son and Daughter-in-Law's Journey to Understanding. In it, they described their own transformation over the past year, acknowledging the mistakes they had made and the pain they had caused, but also celebrating the deeper relationship we had built through honesty and mutual respect. Elena Vasquez taught us that true strength is not about perfection or image management, they had written. It's about resilience, about transforming pain into purpose, about building bridges between people and communities. She showed us that family is not just about blood relations, but about the connections we nurture and the values we pass down. Most importantly, she demonstrated that it's never too late to change course, to choose love over fear, to honor the people who shaped us instead of hiding from our roots. As I read their words, tears streaming down my face, I realized that this journey had transformed all of us in ways I never could have anticipated. The discovery of the diary had been painful, but it had also been necessary, forcing us to confront difficult truths about our family history and our present relationships. The process of rebuilding trust and understanding had been challenging, but it had also been incredibly rewarding, deepening our connections in ways that superficial harmony never could have achieved. The book also included a surprise announcement. Marcus and Brittany had established a scholarship fund in my name at the local community college, providing financial support for women over 40 who were returning to school after escaping domestic violence or rebuilding their lives following major upheavals. The fund would be administered through the community center, ensuring that recipients would also have access to the comprehensive support services we provided. "We wanted to do something that would extend your impact beyond your lifetime," Marcus explained. "Something that would help other women follow the path you pioneered, using education and community support to transform their circumstances." The scholarship fund represented more than just financial assistance. It was a recognition of the model I had created for turning personal trauma into professional purpose, for using education as a tool of empowerment, for building communities that lifted everyone up together. It was validation that the choices I had made, the sacrifices I had endured, and the work I had devoted my life to had been worthy and valuable. As we cleaned up after the party, Isabella sleeping peacefully in her stroller, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in the past year. I had gone from feeling invisible and irrelevant to being celebrated and honored, from worrying about my place in my son's life to being an integral part of my granddaughter's daily experience, from questioning the value of my work to seeing it recognized and expanded by the next generation. But perhaps most importantly, I had reclaimed my own sense of worth and purpose. The woman who had survived domestic violence, who had raised a son while building a career, who had transformed personal pain into community healing, that woman had never actually disappeared. She had simply been waiting for the right moment, to step back into the light, to remind everyone, including herself, that she had always been there, strong and capable and worthy of love and respect. Standing in my kitchen that night, washing dishes while Marcus and Brittany loaded sleeping Isabella into her car seat, I felt a profound sense of peace. The future stretched out before us, filled with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. Sunday dinners and holiday traditions, Spanish lullabies and bedtime stories, graduation ceremonies and birthday parties where I would be not just present, but celebrated. The journey from that moment in the attic when Marcus found the diary to this evening surrounded by family and community had been difficult and painful at times, but it had also been transformative and healing. We had learned that truth, even when it's difficult, has the power to set us free. We had discovered that love, when it's real and unconditional, can overcome years of misunderstanding and neglect, and we had proven that it's never too late to change course, to choose authenticity over appearance, to honor the past while building a better future. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the woman I had been, the woman I was becoming, and the legacy I would leave for Isabella and all the daughters who would come after her. The diary that had once held my darkest secrets had become the key to unlocking my family's brightest future, proving that sometimes our greatest pain can become our most powerful gift. The scholarship fund's first recipient arrived at the community center on a rainy Tuesday morning in September, 18 months after Isabella's first birthday party. Her name was Carmen Silva, a 43-year-old woman with nervous eyes and calloused hands who reminded me so much of myself at that age that I had to steady myself against the desk when she walked into my office. She had fled an abusive marriage with her 2 teenage daughters, bringing nothing but a suitcase and a determination to build a new life that her children could be proud of. Carmen had heard about the Elena Vasquez scholarship through the domestic violence shelter where she was staying, and she wanted to pursue a degree in social work so she could help other women navigate the system she was currently struggling to understand. As she sat across from me describing her dreams of becoming a counselor while working nights to support her daughters, I saw myself 35 years earlier, exhausted but determined, broken but not defeated. I don't want my daughters to think that what they saw at home was normal, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want them to see that women can be strong, that we can build something better after everything falls apart. But I need help learning how to do that. Working with Carmen became one of the most rewarding experiences of my later career. Through the scholarship program, we were able to provide not just tuition assistance, but comprehensive support that addressed the complex challenges facing women in her situation. She attended college classes during the day while her daughters were in school, worked part-time in our after-school program to gain relevant experience, and participated in support groups that connected her with other women rebuilding their lives. Marcus, who had become deeply involved in the scholarship program's administration, helped Carmen develop a long-term career plan that included internship opportunities with social service agencies throughout Los Angeles. Brittany used her marketing skills to connect Carmen with professional women who could serve as mentors, creating a network of support that extended far beyond what any single organization could provide. Watching Carmen's transformation over the course of her first year in the program was like watching a flower bloom in time-lapse photography. The nervous, defeated woman who had first entered my office gradually became confident and articulate, someone who spoke up in class discussions and offered insights based on her lived experiences. Her daughters, initially suspicious of any adult who tried to help their family, began to see the community center as a safe space where they could focus on their homework and plan for their own futures. The success of Carmen's case attracted attention from other organizations and potential funders. Dr. Rodriguez invited me to present our scholarship model at a statewide conference on innovative approaches to supporting domestic violence survivors, and the response was overwhelming. Representatives from community colleges across California wanted to replicate our program, and several foundations expressed interest in providing funding to expand the initiative. You've created something that goes beyond traditional scholarship programs, said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, director of the California Community College Foundation, during our meeting following the conference presentation. This is a holistic approach that recognizes that women escaping trauma need more than just financial assistance. They need community, mentorship, practical support, and most importantly, they need to be seen as whole human beings with valuable perspectives to contribute. The recognition led to an unexpected invitation. The National Association of Social Workers asked me to keynote their annual conference in Chicago, speaking about the intersection of personal experience and professional practice in the field of domestic violence prevention. At 71 years old, I found myself preparing for the largest speaking engagement of my career, an opportunity to share my story and our model with social workers from across the country. Marcus and Brittany insisted on attending the conference with me, bringing 3-year-old Isabella along so she could witness her abuela being honored on a national stage. The night before my speech, we had dinner in our hotel restaurant, and I found myself reflecting on how surreal the situation felt. 5 years earlier, I had been questioning my relevance in my own family's life. Now I was preparing to address thousands of professionals about innovative approaches to community-based social work. "Are you nervous?" Brittany asked as we shared dessert, Isabella coloring contentedly in her lap. "Surprisingly, no," I replied, and I meant it. I spent so many years hiding parts of my story, ashamed of what I had survived, worried that people would see me as weak if they knew the truth about Roberto. But now I understand that my experiences are exactly what give me credibility to speak about this work. The women in our programs don't need perfect role models. They need proof that survival is possible, that trauma can be transformed into strength. The speech went better than I had dared to hope. Standing at the podium in front of 3,000 social workers, I told the story of my journey from domestic violence survivor to community leader, from isolated single mother to nationally recognized advocate. I shared the lessons I had learned about the importance of comprehensive support systems, about the power of peer mentorship, about the need to address not just immediate safety, but long-term empowerment. But the moment that brought me the most joy came near the end of my presentation, when I introduced Carmen via video conference from Los Angeles. She had graduated from her social work program the previous month and had just been hired as a family counselor at a nonprofit organization serving Spanish-speaking communities. Seeing her face on the large screen behind me, confident and radiant as she described her work with other survivors, I felt the profound satisfaction of witnessing the TC cycle of healing and empowerment continue into the next generation. 5 years ago, I thought my life was over, Carmen said to the assembled social workers. I was convinced that I was damaged goods, that I had nothing valuable to offer the world. But Elena and the team at Esperanza Community Center showed me that my experiences, as painful as they were, could become tools for helping other women find their way to safety and independence. Now, every day, I get to be proof for other survivors that recovery is possible, that we can not only rebuild our lives, but use our stories to change other lives. The standing ovation that followed seemed to last forever. As I looked out at the audience of social workers, many of them wiping away tears, I felt a profound sense of completion. The work I had begun in that first support group 35 years earlier, driven by my own need to make sense of what I had endured with Roberto, had evolved into a national model for comprehensive survivor support. After the conference, the theme opportunities multiplied faster than I could have imagined. I was invited to consult with organizations across the country, helping them develop their own versions of our scholarship and support program. A publisher reached out about writing a book that would document our approach and make it accessible to a wider audience. Universities began inviting me as a guest lecturer, asking me to share my perspectives with the next generation of social workers. But perhaps most significantly, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services contacted us about participating in a pilot program that would test innovative approaches to addressing domestic violence in immigrant communities. The grant would provide funding for a 3-year study documenting the effectiveness of our model, with the goal of developing policy recommendations for national implementation. Marcus took a leave of absence from his consulting firm to serve as the project's research coordinator, using his business skills to develop evaluation metrics and data collection systems that would demonstrate the program's impact. Brittany, created a comprehensive digital documentation strategy, ensuring that every aspect of our work would be recorded and analyzed for replication in other communities. Working alongside my son and daughter-in-law on a project that combined my life's work with their professional expertise felt like the culmination of everything I had hoped for when I first became a mother. We were no longer just a family. We were partners in a mission that extended far beyond our personal relationships, collaborators in work that honored both my experiences and their skills. Isabella, now a precocious 4-year-old who spoke fluent Spanish and English, had become the unofficial mascot of the community center. She would accompany me to work several days a week, playing quietly in the corner while I met with families, occasionally approaching newcomers with the fearless curiosity of a child who had grown up surrounded by people from dozens of different countries and cultures. Abuela helps mamas who are sad, she explained to a reporter who was documenting our federal grant project. She teaches them how to be strong like her. The simplicity and accuracy of her assessment made me laugh, but it also reminded me that the most important legacy I was leaving was not the programs or the recognition, but the values I was passing down to the next generation. The book project, which I initially approached with some reluctance, became a powerful vehicle for sharing not just our methodology, but the broader philosophy that guided our work. Working with a collaborative writing team that included Carmen and several other scholarship recipients, we created a resource that combined practical guidance with personal narratives, policy analysis with emotional truth. From survival to service, a community-based approach to healing domestic violence was published by a university press and quickly gained attention from both academic and practitioner audiences. The book tour took me to cities across the country, where I spoke at conferences, universities, and community organizations about the importance of survivor-led programming and the power of transforming personal pain into collective healing. At each stop, I met women who reminded me of myself at different stages of my journey. Social workers who were struggling to serve complex populations with limited resources, and community leaders who were searching for models that could address the root causes of violence rather than just its symptoms. The conversations that followed each presentation were often more valuable than the formal remarks, creating connections between people and organizations that would continue long after. I returned home to Los Angeles. The most meaningful part of the book tour came during a stop in Phoenix, where I met Elena Vasquez, a young social worker who had named her daughter after me following a presentation I had given at her graduate school 3 years earlier. Elena Vasquez had read about our work in professional journals and had structured her master's thesis around our model, eventually implementing a similar program in her own community. "You probably don't remember me," she said as she approached after my presentation, holding the hand of a 6-year-old girl with bright eyes and a confident smile. "But you changed the direction of my career and my understanding of what social work could be. This is Elena, my daughter. I named her after you because I wanted her to grow up knowing that women can transform their pain into power." Meeting little Elena and hearing her mother's story reminded me that the ripple effects of our work extended far beyond what we could measure or document. Every woman who found her voice through our programs, every social worker who adopted our methods, every child who grew up in a family that had been stabilized through our interventions, they were all carrying forward the principles that had emerged from my own journey through darkness into light. As I returned home from the book tour, exhausted but exhilarated by the connections I had made and the impact our work was having, I found myself looking forward to a period of quieter reflection. The federal grant project was entering its 2nd year, with data that clearly demonstrated the effectiveness of our approach. Carmen had been promoted to supervisor at her agency and was implementing our model in her own programs. Marcus and Brittany had announced that they were expecting their 2nd child, a son they planned to name Roberto in honor of the grandfather whose complicated legacy had ultimately brought our family closer together. Sitting in my garden on a warm evening in late October, watching Isabella help her father plant bulbs that would bloom in the spring, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The diary that Marcus had found in the attic 4 years earlier had seemed like a source of shame and pain, but it had ultimately become the key to unlocking deeper truths about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of authentic relationships. The woman I had become was not separate from the woman who had endured Roberto's violence, or the woman who had questioned her worth in the face of exclusion and dismissal. She was the integration of all those experiences, the proof that survival could become service, that pain could become purpose, that even the most difficult truths could ultimately set us free. As the sun set behind the mountains and Isabella's laughter filled the air, I whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for the long and winding path that had led me home to myself and to the family that now knew and celebrated every part of my story. The future stretched out before us, filled with new challenges and opportunities to serve, new lives to touch and transform, new proof that love, when it's rooted in truth and watered with respect, can overcome any obstacle and heal any wound. The unexpected phone call came on a Tuesday morning in February, just as I was finishing my coffee and preparing to leave for a meeting with the federal grant evaluation team. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but warm, introducing herself as Dr. Patricia Williams from the MacArthur Foundation. My heart skipped a beat as she explained the reason for her call. Words that seemed too surreal to be true flowing through my phone like a dream I was afraid to wake up from. Elena, I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected as a MacArthur Fellow for your innovative work in community-based domestic violence prevention and your transformative approach to survivor empowerment, she said, her voice carrying the weight of an announcement that would change everything. The fellowship recognizes individuals who have demonstrated exceptional creativity and potential for important future contributions to their field and society. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the phone trembling in my hand as Dr. Williams continued to explain the details of the fellowship, the unrestricted funding that would allow me to expand our work in ways I had never imagined possible. The MacArthur Fellowship, often called the Genius Grant, was recognition I had never dreamed of receiving, validation from the highest levels of American philanthropy that the work born from my personal pain had national significance. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen for nearly an hour, watching the morning light shift across the walls as the magnitude of this recognition settled in. At 73 years old, I was being honored not despite my unconventional path to social work, but because of it. Not in spite of my history as a domestic violence survivor, but as a direct result of how I had transformed that experience into a model for healing entire communities. The news broke publicly 3 days later, and the response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with congratulations from colleagues, former clients, and social workers from across the country who had attended my presentations. The community center was flooded with media requests, and suddenly our quiet work in East Los Angeles was being featured in national newspapers and television programs. Marcus and Brittany arrived at my house within hours of the announcement, bringing Isabella and 4-month-old Roberto, whose bright eyes and infectious smile had already made him the center of attention wherever he went. As we sat together in my living room, the same space where I had once felt invisible and forgotten, I marveled at how completely our family dynamic had transformed. "Mom, this is incredible," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he scrolled through the flood of congratulatory messages on social media. "Do you realize what this means? You're being recognized as one of the most innovative thinkers in America. Your work is going to reach millions of people now." Brittany, who had become one of my closest collaborators and fiercest advocates, was already strategizing about how to leverage this recognition to expand our impact. "The MacArthur Fellowship is going to open doors we never even knew existed," she said, bouncing Roberto gently while he dozed in her arms. "We could develop online training programs, create a national network of community centers using your model, maybe even influence federal policy around domestic violence prevention." But as exciting as these possibilities were, what moved me most was Isabella's reaction to the news. At 5 years old, she didn't fully understand the significance of the MacArthur Fellowship, but she grasped that her abuela was being honored for work that mattered. During dinner that evening, she stood up at the table and announced with the solemn formality of a child making an important proclamation, "I'm proud that my abuela helps people. When I grow up, I want to help people too, just like her." The fellowship brought with it not just recognition but resources that allowed us to dream bigger than ever before. The MacArthur Foundation's unrestricted funding meant that for the first time in my career, I could pursue innovative approaches without worrying about whether they fit within the narrow parameters of traditional grant requirements. I could take risks, experiment with new models, and invest in long-term solutions that might take years to show results. One of the first initiatives we launched with MacArthur support was the Intergenerational Healing Project, a program that brought together domestic violence survivors from different generations to share their experiences and mentor each other through various stages of recovery. The program paired women like Carmen, who had rebuilt their lives and were now working as professionals in the field, with newer survivors who were just beginning their journeys toward independence. The results were remarkable. The older survivors found renewed purpose in sharing their wisdom and demonstrating that recovery was possible, while the newer participants gained hope and practical guidance from women who had walked similar paths. We documented decreased rates of depression and anxiety among participants, increased engagement in educational and career development programs, and stronger connections to community resources. Isabella often accompanied me to these intergenerational sessions, playing quietly in the corner while women shared their stories and strategies for healing. Watching her absorb these conversations about resilience and transformation, I realized that she was receiving an education in human strength and community building that no traditional classroom could provide. She was learning that difficult experiences could become sources of wisdom, that helping others was one of the most meaningful ways to spend one's time, and that families were not just defined by blood relations, but by the networks of support we create for each other. The MacArthur Fellowship also enabled us to establish the Elena Vasquez Institute for Community-Based Healing, a research and training center that would develop and disseminate innovative approaches to addressing trauma in immigrant and marginalized communities. Located in a renovated building adjacent to the original Esperanza Community Center, the institute became a hub for social workers, researchers, and community organizers from around the world who wanted to learn about our model. Marcus took on the role of the institute's executive director, bringing his business expertise to bear on the challenge of scaling effective community interventions. Under his leadership, we developed partnership agreements with universities in 12 states, creating a network of research sites that would test and refine our approaches in diverse cultural and geographic contexts. Brittany became the Institute's Director of Communications and Knowledge Sharing, using her digital expertise to create online training modules that made our methodology accessible to organizations that couldn't afford to send staff to Los Angeles for in-person training. Her work ensured that the innovations emerging from our community could benefit survivors and social workers, regardless of their location or resources. The most ambitious project we launched was the Community Healing Corps, a national service program that recruited recent college graduates to spend 2 years working in community-based organizations while receiving intensive training in trauma-informed care and community organizing. The program was designed to address the chronic shortage of qualified staff in social service organizations, while also creating a pipeline of professionals who understood the importance of community-based approaches to healing. The first cohort of Community Healing Corps members included 25 recent graduates from colleges across the country, representing diverse backgrounds and academic disciplines, but united by their commitment to social justice and community service. During their 2-year placements, they would receive ongoing mentorship from experienced practitioners, participate in monthly training seminars, and conduct research projects that contributed to our growing understanding of effective intervention strategies. One of the core members, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had graduated from UCLA with a degree in psychology, was placed at our original community center, where she worked directly with families while also helping to evaluate the effectiveness of our programs. Sarah reminded me of myself at her age, idealistic and determined, but also somewhat naive about the complexities of systemic change. Watching her navigate the challenges of community work while maintaining her optimism and commitment was like seeing my younger self through the lens of experience and wisdom. "Elena, can I ask you something personal?" Sarah said one afternoon as we walked through the neighborhood surrounding the community center, visiting families who had recently graduated from our programs. "How did you maintain hope during the years when you were struggling with your own situation at home? How did you keep believing that change was possible when your personal life felt so stuck?" Her question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so direct and honest. "I think I kept hope alive by pouring myself into work that mattered," I replied after thinking for a moment. "When I couldn't control what happened in my own home, I focused on creating change in other people's lives. Every family I helped gave me proof that transformation was possible, even when I couldn't see it in my own circumstances." We stopped to visit Carmen, who now lived in a modest but comfortable apartment with her daughters, both of whom were thriving in college thanks to scholarships and support from our programs. Carmen greeted us warmly, serving coffee and homemade pastries while sharing updates about her work and her daughter's achievements. As we sat in her living room, surrounded by family photos and her daughter's academic awards, I saw Sarah's eyes widen with understanding. "This is what you mean about hope," Sarah said quietly after we left Carmen's apartment. "It's not abstract optimism. It's concrete evidence that people can build better lives, that communities can heal, that individual actions can create ripple effects that last for generations." The Community Healing Core program attracted national attention, with several members of Congress citing it as an example of innovative approaches to addressing social problems. When the program was featured in a PBS documentary about grassroots solutions to domestic violence, I found myself once again in the surreal position of being interviewed about work that had emerged from the most painful chapters of my personal life. During the documentary filming, the producer asked me to return to the house where Marcus and I had lived with Roberto, a small bungalow in Highland Park that had been converted into a duplex sometime in the intervening decades. Standing on the sidewalk where I had once waited for Roberto to come home, never knowing whether he would be loving or violent, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and gratitude. "This is where it all began," I said to the camera, gesturing toward the modest house with its chain-link fence and small front yard. "This is where I learned that survival requires both courage and strategy, that love and fear can coexist in the same space, that even in our darkest moments we can choose to believe that better days are possible." The documentary, titled "From Survivor to Healer, the Elena Vasquez Story," aired during National Domestic Violence Awareness Month and reached millions of viewers across the country. The response was overwhelming, with thousands of women reaching out to share their own stories and ask for guidance about escaping abusive relationships or rebuilding their lives after trauma. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Roberto Jr., who was now 18 months old and had begun walking, with the confident determination that reminded me so much of his father at that age. During a family dinner following the documentary's premiere, little Roberto toddled over to the bookshelf where I kept a framed photo of his grandfather, pointing at the picture and saying clearly, "Abuelo." Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he watched his son recognize the grandfather he would never meet, the complicated man whose legacy had ultimately brought our family closer together. "He looks so much like Dad in that photo," Marcus said softly, picking up Roberto and holding him close. "But he's going to grow up in a completely different world, surrounded by love and support and examples of healthy relationships." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful we had ever shared as a family. We talked about the importance of honoring Roberto's memory, while also being honest about his struggles, about teaching Isabella and Roberto Jr. to understand their family history without being burdened by its pain, about creating traditions that celebrated healing and growth rather than perfectionism and silence. As I looked around the dinner table that evening, watching my son hold his children while his wife shared stories about her latest projects at the Institute, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The MacArthur Fellowship had given us resources and recognition that would allow our work to continue for generations. But more importantly, it had validated the belief that had sustained me through the darkest periods of my life, that our individual stories of survival and healing can become sources of hope and transformation for entire communities. The woman who had hidden bruises under long sleeves while counseling other women to leave their abusers had become a nationally recognized expert on community-based healing. The mother who had been systematically excluded from her son's life had become his closest collaborator in work that honored both their experiences and their shared values. The survivor who had once questioned her own worth had become proof that trauma, when met with courage and community support, can be transformed into wisdom, purpose, and lasting change. As Isabella helped me clear the dinner dishes, chattering in both English and Spanish about her plans to become a helper-like abuela when she grew up, I smiled at the realization that the most important legacy I would leave was not the programs or the recognition, but the understanding that strength comes not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into something that serves others. The invitation from the United Nations arrived on a spring morning that felt charged with possibility, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to whisper that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The letter, printed on official UN letterhead, requested my participation in the Global Summit on Community-Based Solutions to Gender Violence, scheduled to take place in Geneva during the fall. As I read the formal language describing my selection as a keynote speaker representing innovative grassroots approaches to healing trauma, I felt the familiar sensation of disbelief that had accompanied so many unexpected turns in my journey. The summit would bring together advocates, policymakers, and survivors from over 60 countries to share strategies for addressing gender-based violence through community-led initiatives. My presentation would focus on the replicable elements of our Los Angeles model, with particular emphasis on how cultural responsiveness and survivor leadership could be integrated into programs serving diverse populations worldwide. Marcus found me in the garden that afternoon, still holding the UN invitation and watching Isabella teach her little brother Roberto how to plant marigold seeds in the raised beds we had built together. At 6 years old, Isabella had developed an impressive vocabulary in both English and Spanish, often serving as translator when new families visited the community center, her natural confidence putting nervous parents at ease. "You're going to speak at the United Nations," Marcus said, sitting beside me on the garden bench and shaking his head with wonder. "Do you remember when I was little, and you used to tell me that ordinary people could change the world if they cared enough to try? I don't think I really understood what you meant until now." The months leading up to the Geneva summit became a period of intensive preparation that energized our entire team. Carmen, who had completed her master's degree in social work and was now pursuing a doctorate while working as our institute's director of survivor services, collaborated with me on developing presentation materials that would make our approach accessible to international audiences with varying cultural contexts and resource limitations. Brittany coordinated with UN staff to ensure that our presentation would be simultaneously translated into multiple languages and that supporting materials would be available in formats accessible to participants with different technological capabilities. Her attention to detail and understanding of global communication strategies proved invaluable as we worked to distill 37 years of community-based practice into a presentation that could inspire and inform audiences across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The most meaningful aspect of our preparation involved conducting listening sessions with survivors from various immigrant communities throughout Los Angeles, gathering insights about how our model could be adapted for different cultural contexts, while maintaining its core principles of dignity, empowerment, and community connection. These conversations reminded me that while the specific manifestations of gender-based violence varied across cultures, the fundamental human needs for safety, respect, and opportunity remained constant. During one particularly powerful session, a woman named Fatima al-Hassan, who had fled domestic violence in Somalia before rebuilding her life in Los Angeles, spoke about the importance of integrating traditional healing practices with contemporary, social work approaches. In my culture, we have ceremonies for marking transitions, for acknowledging when someone has survived something difficult and is ready to step into a new role in the community, she explained. Your programs helped me find safety and independence, but the healing ceremonies helped me reclaim my identity as someone worthy of respect and love. Fatima's insights led us to develop a new component of our presentation, focusing on the integration of cultural practices and contemporary intervention strategies. We documented how various communities we served had adapted our basic framework to include elements like prayer circles, storytelling traditions, artistic expression, and intergenerational ceremonies that honored both survival and transformation. The trip to Geneva became a family affair when Marcus and Brittany decided to bring Isabella and Roberto Jr. along, viewing it as an educational opportunity and a chance to show international colleagues that effective advocacy was compatible with strong family relationships. As our plane lifted off from Los Angeles International Airport, I looked down at the sprawling city where I had built my life and career, feeling grateful for roots deep enough to support whatever growth lay ahead. The United Nations building in Geneva was even more impressive in person than I had imagined. Its flags from member nations fluttering in the crisp autumn air as delegates from around the world gathered for a week of presentations, workshops, and collaborative planning sessions. Walking through the corridors where decisions affecting millions of people were made daily, I felt both humbled by the magnitude of global challenges and energized by the opportunity to contribute to solutions. My presentation was scheduled for the summit's second day, in the main assembly hall before an audience of over 800 international delegates. The night before, I couldn't sleep, not from nervousness but from excitement about the conversations that might emerge from sharing our story on such a significant platform. I spent the early morning hours reviewing my notes one final time, thinking about Roberto, about the diary Marcus had found in the attic, about all the women whose courage had contributed to the work I was about to present. Standing at the podium in the UN Assembly Hall, looking out at hundreds of faces representing every continent on Earth, I began with the words that had become central to my understanding of effective advocacy. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm here not despite being a survivor of domestic violence, but because of everything that survival taught me about the power of community to heal even the deepest wounds. The presentation that followed traced the evolution of our work from my personal experience of abuse and recovery through the development of community-based programs that had now served thousands of families across multiple countries. I shared data demonstrating the effectiveness of our approach while also telling stories that illustrated the human impact of trauma-informed, culturally responsive programming. But the moment that generated the most powerful response came when I introduced Isabella via video conference from our hotel room, where she was spending the day exploring Geneva with her father and baby brother. Speaking directly to the International Assembly with the unself-conscious confidence of a 6-year-old who had grown up surrounded by people working for social justice, Isabella said simply, "My abuela teaches people that they can be strong even when bad things happen to them. I want to do that too when I grow up." The spontaneous applause that followed lasted nearly 3 minutes, and I saw tears in the eyes of delegates who understood that they were witnessing not just a presentation about innovative programming, but a living example of how healing could extend across generations. Isabella's presence, even through a video screen, demonstrated that children could grow up understanding strength as something that lifted others up, rather than something that diminished or controlled them. The response to our presentation exceeded every expectation. During the question and answer session, Delegates from countries as diverse as Nigeria, Bangladesh, Colombia, and Sweden shared examples of how they plan to adapt elements of our model for their own contexts. A representative from the European Union inquired about the possibility of funding pilot programs based on our approach in refugee resettlement communities, while delegates from several African nations requested technical assistance for integrating survivor leadership into existing programming. The most moving response came from Dr. Amara Cisse, a psychiatrist from Sierra Leone who had survived civil war trauma before becoming an advocate for women affected by conflict-related violence. "What you have shown us," she said, addressing me directly from the assembly floor, "is that healing is not something that happens to survivors, but something that survivors can lead and direct for themselves and their communities. This changes everything about how we think about intervention and empowerment." The conversations that continued throughout the week led to the formation of the International Coalition for Community-Based Healing, a network of organizations committed to implementing survivor-led approaches to addressing gender-based violence. As the founding coordinator of this coalition, our institute would provide training and technical assistance to member organizations, while also learning from their innovations and adaptations. The coalition's first initiative involved establishing sister city partnerships between communities in the United States and organizations in other countries, creating opportunities for direct exchange of strategies and mutual support. Our community center in East Los Angeles was paired with a women's cooperative in rural Guatemala, a refugee resettlement organization in Jordan, and a domestic violence shelter in the Philippines, relationships that would allow for ongoing collaboration and shared learning. During the summit's final day, I had the opportunity to meet privately with several other keynote speakers, including Dr. Denis Mukwege, the Congolese gynecologist and Nobel Peace Prize winner, whose work with survivors of sexual violence had inspired advocates worldwide. Our conversation about the intersection of individual healing and community transformation reinforced my understanding that effective advocacy required both intimate knowledge of trauma's impact and broad vision for systemic change. "The work you have built in Los Angeles demonstrates something essential," Dr. Mukwege told me as we shared coffee in the UN Delegates Lounge. "Healing cannot be imposed from outside. It must be cultivated from within communities, by people who understand both the wounds and the possibilities for restoration. Your model shows how this principle can be translated into concrete programs that serve real families." The flight home from Geneva felt different from any return journey I had ever experienced. As I watched the lights of European cities give way to the vast darkness of the Atlantic Ocean, I reflected on how dramatically my life had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined during those early years of hiding bruises and wondering if survival was the best I could hope for. Isabella slept curled against my side, her head resting on my shoulder as she dreamed whatever dreams occupy the minds of children who have grown up believing that adults exist to protect and nurture them. Watching her peaceful face in the dim cabin light, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude that she would never know the fear that had defined so much of my early adulthood, that her understanding of strength would be rooted in compassion rather than control. The weeks following our return from Geneva brought a flurry of activity as we began implementing the partnerships and initiatives that had emerged from the summit. The International Coalition for Community-Based Healing officially launched with 15 founding member organizations, each committed to piloting elements of our survivor-led approach within their own cultural and geographic contexts. Carmen took the lead on developing the training materials that would support these international partnerships, drawing on her own experience as both survivor and practitioner to create resources that honored the complexity of trauma while providing practical guidance for community-based healing. Her doctoral dissertation research, which focused on cultural adaptations of our model, became the foundation for training modules that could be customized for different linguistic and cultural communities. The sister city partnership with the Women's Cooperative in Guatemala proved particularly meaningful, as it connected our Spanish-speaking families with women who shared similar cultural backgrounds, but were working to address gender-based violence. within very different economic and political contexts. Through monthly video conferences and annual exchange visits, participants on both sides of the partnership gained new perspectives on resilience and mutual support. Marcus and Brittany collaborated on documenting these international partnerships through a multimedia project that would make their innovations accessible to other organizations, considering similar collaborations. Their work captured not just the programmatic elements of these partnerships, but also the personal transformations that occurred when survivors from different countries recognized their shared experiences and mutual strength. As autumn deepened into winter, I found myself reflecting on the circular nature of healing and growth. The diary that Marcus had discovered in our attic had contained some of the darkest moments of my life, but sharing those experiences had ultimately led to recognition and opportunities that would benefit survivors around the world. The pain I had once hidden in shame had become a source of wisdom and connection that transcended cultural and geographic boundaries. During Isabella's 7th birthday party, held in the community center's main hall and attended by families from dozens of countries, I watched her move easily between groups of children speaking different languages, translating when needed, and including everyone in the games and activities. Her natural ability to bridge differences and create inclusive spaces reminded me that the next generation was growing up with skills and perspectives that could help heal divisions that had persisted for centuries. Roberto Jr., now a confident 2-year-old with his grandfather's dark eyes and his father's gentle disposition, toddled around the party carrying a small stuffed animal that Carmen had given him, stopping to share it with other children whenever he encountered someone who seemed sad or left out. Watching his instinctive generosity, I saw evidence that kindness and empathy could be cultivated from the earliest ages when children grew up in communities that valued connection over competition. As the party wound down and families began to head home, Marcus approached me with a serious expression that reminded me of the day he had found the diary. "Mom, there's something Brittany and I want to discuss with you," he said, gesturing for us to sit together in the quiet corner where I often met with families seeking services. "We've been talking about the future, about what happens when you're ready to step back from the day-to-day leadership of the Institute," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "We want to make sure that everything you've built continues to grow and evolve, that the principles you've established remain at the center of whatever comes next." What followed was a conversation about succession planning and legacy preservation that I had been avoiding, but knew was necessary. At 75 years old, I remained healthy and energetic, but I also understood the importance of ensuring that our work would continue regardless of my personal circumstances. Marcus and Brittany had developed a comprehensive plan for gradually transitioning leadership to the next generation while maintaining the survivor-centered, community-based approach that defined our identity. The plan included expanding Carmen's role to executive director of the Institute, establishing an advisory board of survivors who would guide programmatic decisions, and creating endowment funds that would ensure financial sustainability for decades to come. Most importantly, it included provisions for maintaining our international partnerships and continuing to innovate in response to changing community needs. As I listened to their thoughtful proposal, I felt a profound sense of completion and continuity. The work that had emerged from my personal journey through trauma and recovery had evolved into an international movement that would continue growing long after I was gone. The diary that had once contained my darkest secrets had become the foundation for a legacy of healing that would touch lives across generations and continents. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.